This is the current proposal by Shell to expand the Carmen Creek facility, tripling or quadrupling it in size. One final in situ extraction area is south of McMurray. It's called the Athabasca area. There's been very little done so far, but much planned in the future. I haven't had a chance to compile it all. It is basically between Cold Lake and Fort McMurray. So what I'm going to show you here, next to the little Aboriginal village of Anzac, is a gigantic project, all based on surface extraction and based on burning coke in order to extract the tar, which is extremely greenhouse gas intensive. This is the Opti-Nexen project, and this is just the plant that they're building. They haven't gotten around to completing all of the extraction wells. So, to put it all into perspective, this is within this area the size of Florida, which is undergoing a rate of deforestation second only to the Amazon, as Macdonald pointed out. These are the projects that I've been able to compile so far. Many more. Because these are the leases that have been issued by the Alberta government. The Alberta government makes several $1 billion a year just issuing leases. Most of that area has been leased. So there's no end to this. But where's all this going? So let's take a somewhat more continental perspective. Right now, there's about a million barrels of bitumen or synthetic crude oil being exported from the tar sands into the United States along the existing pipeline infrastructure. It's going as far south as New Orleans, as far east as Ohio, where it's being refined by Sunoco, which is also owned by the Pugh family, who we talked about earlier. It's going here to a place in the Texas Panhandle, Colorado, Salt Lake City, and Seattle. So that's about 1 million barrels of oil a day. Despite what the mainstream environmental groups tell you, sometimes call them gang green, about a moratorium, many of whom are funded by the Pew Charitable Trusts, or something that's called the Canadian Boreal Initiative, and now a new one, the International Boreal Conservation Project. Despite what they tell you, we see that a moratorium is not enough, perhaps in order to ensure some level of survival on this planet. Stopping the tar sands is in order. Thank you very much.
I had done some traveling into the Northwest Territories and Yukon and heard the stories about what the Mackenzie Gas Project, or what had previously been the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, were likely to have as an environmental impact and an impact on the indigenous communities of Denende from north to south of the Northwest Territories. And my concern around that, of course, if you're following pipelines, you follow in the industry jargon, you go downstream. We're not done. But we get after that point is getting into how do we build all of this stuff. Well, basically one of the main things is we don't have the labor. In Alberta, the reason housing prices are so high is because they're currently flying in people weekly. So you can work out of St. John's and do 4 days on working in the area north of Fort McMurray and then fly back to spend the time with the weekend. And that's not because the companies really want you to stay in touch with your kids. It's because it's the only way they can convince people to come out. Now that Danny Williams has done his little gambit to get offshore gas going in the Newfoundland area, there's a very strong likelihood that some of the people from Newfoundland will start to head back. And at the very least, there's going to be no way to tap into a domestic market for labor here. Here's where we should introduce the SPP. We've probably heard that the Security and Prosperity Partnership being proposed by the so-called Three Amigos is designed to help facilitate a massive expansion of temporary foreign workers programs. That is to do this. They are going to be building areas which need tens of thousands of workers that do not exist currently. What's a better win-win for capitalism than having a giant slave pool that you can pay way under market value, whatever that market value actually means in the real world, where they are not allowed to leave their work site, where unions are not allowed to come visit them, and in their one little pilot project for temporary foreign workers that CNRL has been running for the last year, they've already killed 2 and maimed 4 by forcing them to learn on the job in a second language. This is part of the procedure that this is all going under. The SPP specifically calls for the reduction of environmental regulations to facilitate this and streamline. It also makes certain that we absolutely have to have these workers. There is no way out of dealing with this particular issue of labor without signing on to something which basically scraps everyone's labor rights and, like I say, creates a vast pool of basic slave labor. The word basic is a qualifying word. But if you can't leave, you can't talk to anybody, you are a slave. So let's just go to that. TILMA within Alberta and BC, which was recently rejected by Saskatchewan, is different than the SPP because it's actually legislated, whereas the SPP is coming up with streamlined policies. TILMA actually comes out with stating if there is one policy in one province, the other one cannot create something the slightest bit better. They'll use it has to be the same. I say they can't be better. And that really is what it comes down to on those levels. An example of the absurdity of TILMA would be if there's a nuclear plant, which they're now in a proposal of putting into the Peace River area. Vancouver is no longer a nuclear-free zone. It's illegal. So think about that when they start talking about 20 nuclear plants for Alberta. The furthest west they exist now is in southern Ontario. That's what we're facing. That's part of the bigger picture here. Uranium mining for those nuclear plants, which are for the tar sands, which are for the U.S. military machine, will come out of northern Saskatchewan. They'll come out of the areas in the Northwest Territories near what's called Great Bear Lake or the Satu. That whole area has already had what they call the village widows, a population that helped build actually Fat Man and Little Boy in World War II when it was dropped, a combination of the uranium there and in the Congo. Those particular mines are actually restarted being cleaned up, and they're actually mining the tailings from the previous mine in the near future. That's what they're going to have to go to get the uranium. Uranium doesn't just pop anywhere. So these are all issues of self-determination. These are all issues of workers' rights. They go way beyond the usual picture of water, climate change, and trees. Although those are by far exponentially off the graph enough to make us really, really concerned. Why is this all happening right now? Canada, with the exception of Venezuela, is, according to geologists, the only single country in the world that has a large oil basis that can actually grow in production. We're heading into a term, we can debate the year, but we are heading into peak oil very soon. So this is the plan. So we don't have another plan. It's not about fuel-efficient cars and alternative energy and biofuels and all that. This is the plan for the situation. That currently is where we're going. Nobody else has it. Why do they need all of this oil? A lot of it has to do with something called the War on Terror. As the price of oil was driven up by what we would have to call the instability of the Middle Eastern region, that price all of a sudden made tar sands economical. Tar sands only exist at an economical rate of $35 or more a barrel. That doesn't include transport costs to places like the Middle East where you have to fuel tankers and so forth. What you need to deal with in this situation is something that means that they know the price of oil is not going back down. So they're hedging their bets. Naomi Klein, back in March, wrote an article called Baghdad Burns While Calgary Booms. Calgary's the financial epicenter. Edmonton's where the workers come out of and end up trying to make a life outside of Fort McMurray. What's happening in this whole scenario is that Canada is currently watching the basis of the War on Terror's need to continue on the growth. Pardon me, I got to backtrack that thought for a second. The current production rate is necessary to try to keep up with making certain that what happens in Iraq doesn't happen in the next 2 weeks. In other words, they're not going to be able to pacify the population. That's become abundantly clear to all of us. So they're hedging their bets by using that spike in price, which is currently artificial, to be able to do the tar sands. So if they can, which is their goal, force the rest of the world to just hand over their oil so that the United States, as Dick Cheney put it, the U.S. way of life is non-negotiable. This is the plan. That means we're going to go and fight these wars. We're going to use the tar sands to do it. And then once these wars are over, peak oil will be sufficiently underway so that the price can never come down. They can continue with the war on terror. They can continue with the tar sand. And they can do it at the cost of everything that we already assume hasn't really gone that far. But it has. Carbon trading is essentially trading the future for the present, or it's trading poverty for wealth. And this Knoll scam that we've heard about, we hear a lot about Al Gore. And anybody who paid any attention to the Clinton administration already knows he's a war criminal by every measure. But even beyond that, this nonsense we're hearing about what's coming out of Bali really needs to be challenged for a major reason. When George Bush's government pulled out of Kyoto 8 years ago, what that meant was the U.S.'s isolation position, note that this pathetic thing that they were trying to put together would just sort of not use the U.S. By Gore recently forcing themselves into it, it managed to water down the targets ever further in order to accommodate bringing the U.S. on board. So what Gore has done, even if one thinks that he's motivated for the right reasons, his family is tied to the nuclear industry, by the way. We should keep that in mind. Has actually led us to a point right now where things are actually worse, not better, because of the recent Bali discussions.
They lowered everything, didn't they?
What we have to deal with as well when we talk about these issues is that the whole point of things like the film, the things about the basic human rights issues that we don't get enough into, is that this whole issue has a human face to it. It's not like the usual panacea that we see of some beautiful landscape somewhere. Every single one of these issues is about our human rights and about the rights of other people as well. Like, there's a slogan that came out of Edmonton. Everyone may be downstream, but some are more downstream than others, and we should pay attention to that. One other concern I have is that there are people, I'm not going to name names here, but there are people involved in what Petr called gangrene who don't really want to discuss peak oil. And I think that has to do with the fact that a lot of the green movement is tied to a capitalist solution to the problem. And that means that they want to sell the idea that we can somehow change capitalism to deal with the climate crisis. But if we face peak oil, what we're actually dealing with is a denial in order to not give industry the excuse to go after tar sands and to go after these other things like oil shale and clean coal and so on, which are actually going to exponentially ascend climate changing gases into the stratosphere. The reason that has to be continually jumbled in people's mind, to put it in the most cynical way so that you can get another thing dropped in your mailbox asking you for an appeal based on climate change. The solution here is not about greening capitalism, it's about destroying capitalism, and that's what I would like to end on.